Hey everyone, welcome back to Flourishing with a Facial Difference. My name is Brooke, and today's episode is all about why I started a podcast. So before I start explaining why I started a podcast, one thing that I want to start incorporating before every episode is a motivational quote. Another podcast that I listen to does this, and I think it's such a great and positive way to start each episode. Today's motivational quote is, "The two things in life that you are in total control over are your attitude and your effort." I absolutely love that quote, and I think that it was perfectly fitting for this week's episode. So I ended up doing a poll on Instagram asking everyone who listens what they wanted to hear for this week. 57% of the votes went to why I started a podcast, and 43% went to all about my hearing loss. Now I am going to eventually do an episode all about my hearing loss, but I had so much fun letting you guys vote on which one you wanted to hear first. And if you want to take place in another poll that I decide to do, just to get some feedback, you can follow me at Facial Difference Podcast on Instagram. One of the biggest reasons why I decided to start a podcast of my own is because I actually primarily listen to podcasts. I almost never listen to music unless someone sends me a song or unless I'm going on a super short drive. I don't know what it is, but lately I just prefer podcasts over music or audiobooks or anything like that. I will listen to a podcast when I'm cooking, when I'm cleaning, mostly when I'm driving. I think it's such a great way to take in content while you're doing other things. That's one thing I hate about watching movies or TV or videos is in order to get all of the content, in order to get all of the information, you have to seriously focus on what it is you're watching. Whereas a podcast, you can be doing several different things at the same time as listening to all the content. I just love that concept. I love the concept of being able to multitask and still get some information in. Another reason why I started a podcast was I absolutely loved blogging. I don't know if anyone knew this, but I did have a blog. It was called Transformational 20s at brooksbrew.weebly.com. I did it for about a year, and I don't have that many posts, but it was a lot of fun. I just didn't like typing. I think that I can talk a lot more than I can type. And it's a lot more fun, in my opinion. I'm not really a typing or writing kind of girl. I mostly just like to talk and get things off my mind. I also don't really read blogs, so that was one reason why I didn't think that having a blog was necessarily fitting for me, because if I don't read them, what makes me think that I can write them, if that makes sense? It just wasn't passionate to me. And also, my blog wasn't about my facial difference at all. It was mostly just about me and my life, completely separate from my facial difference, and I don't think that it had much substance to it because it just wasn't important to me. I wasn't writing about something that I was passionate about, whereas my podcast, I'm so passionate about spreading awareness about my facial difference. Another reason why I wanted to start a podcast revolved around my facial difference is because I met someone named Ariel Henley. Hey girl, if you're listening. Ariel was born with croussons along with her twin, and Ariel has a book coming out in the next year or two, I think, called A Face for Picasso. And in her book, she explains all about her facial difference and how she lived with it and how her and her sister coped and her sister's experience with it. I'm super excited to read it. I think it's going to be so amazing, and I can't wait to see all of the relatable things that are going to be in it. Along with finding out about Ariel's book, I also found out that September was Craniofacial Awareness Month, and to be honest, I had no idea that there was a month dedicated to people who have craniofacial differences, and I thought that was so incredible. And when I saw how big the community is of people who were born different, it blew my mind, and it really lit a fire under my belly because it made me want to share my story and share my experiences and be a part of this group of people who were born different, because that's truly where I belong. I had actually wanted to start a podcast for a while, and a couple of things had stopped me. Number one being I didn't know what to talk about. I didn't know what to revolve my podcast around, because in my mind, I was just a normal person who didn't have anything significant to say. And another reason that stopped me from doing a podcast a lot sooner was I just didn't know how. In mid-September, I couldn't contain myself. I wanted to start a podcast. I was going to figure out how to do it, and it wasn't easy. I will say that starting a podcast is not easy at all because, number one, you have to find a podcast host. And that was something that was totally new to me. I didn't even know what that meant. And I did ask another friend who does have a podcast all about self-empowerment, and her name is Kayla Lippens. You should look her up on Apple Podcast. She's absolutely incredible, and I think she is now in the top 100 podcast for mental health. So good for you, Kayla. And I talked to her and I asked her a little bit about podcast hosts and what host site she used. Now, if you're unfamiliar with podcasting, you have to have a host, and you post your episodes on that host, and that host will post it on any platform that you choose. My podcast is available on SoundCloud, YouTube, Spotify, and I think it's on Google Play, but I'm not 100% sure because I don't use Google Play. I do eventually want to get my podcast on Apple Podcast, but for now it's primarily on SoundCloud, YouTube, and Spotify. I wasn't going to let not knowing how to start a podcast stop me, so I did my research, I did what I had to do, and I figured it out. And I think that that should go for anything in life that you want to do. If you don't know how to do something, do not let that stop you. Figure it out. I wish that I could remember what happened when I finally figured out that I wanted to do a podcast revolved around my facial difference. I do know that it had so much to do with Ariel Henley's book and it being Craniofacial Awareness Month, but I don't remember what clicked in my mind, hey, I want to do a podcast revolved around my facial difference, because that is so weird for me. Like I told you guys, I don't talk about myself at all. So the fact that I wanted to do a podcast where all I do is talk about my facial difference, that is so weird to me. It's such new territory. And it took a lot of self-convincing to follow through with it, because this is not something that I ever saw for myself. I never once envisioned that I would ever be so open with my facial difference. I'm so glad that I pushed all of my fears aside, because I am truly having so much fun with this podcast. I think it's so amazing and I feel so good about it. Another reason why I wanted to start a podcast is because I really wanted a chance to connect with people that also have a facial difference or a difference at all. And I have, and I'm so glad that my podcast has expanded and reached people who also have a facial difference. I have a few people in mind as I'm talking about this, but I've actually made some friends who were born with a visible difference, and I think it is so awesome that we somehow found each other. I have made internet friends that have family members that have a facial difference. I've actually got a friend on Instagram now who her daughter was born with Pfeiffer syndrome, and her daughter is almost 2 years old, I think, and she is so beautiful. She is so cute, and I love being able to connect with her mom, and I think that she has such a beautiful family. And I love that my podcast has reached that sort of audience. That's exactly what I wanted. I want people who have a difference to listen to this and have someone that they can relate to, because I am having so much fun finding people that I'm able to relate to through my podcast. Now, of course, my podcast is not just for people who have a facial difference or any kind of difference at all. It's for anyone who wants to learn, who wants to get to know someone who has a facial difference, who wants to know what it's like. My podcast is to educate people. It's to let some of my friends know a little bit more about me. I don't want to make this a super personal podcast, although that's pretty much what it's ending up being, because how else can you share experiences without them getting super personal? But I definitely want my podcast to reach an array of different kind of people, and I want to share my life. I want to share what it's like being someone who's different. One of the last reasons that I can think of as to why I started a podcast is it has allowed me to be more open and more inviting and just share my story and what it was like being born different. It's definitely not something that I'm used to, but I can honestly say that ever since I started my podcast, I walk differently. I talk differently. I act different. I love that I have this new glow, I guess might be a good word. I feel so different on the inside now that I have this podcast. And I think it's because now information that was so hard for me to share is out in the world. It's open. It's for anyone to hear. And I feel like a huge weight has been lifted, because even though it's super obvious that I do have a facial difference, I felt like it was a secret. I lived my daily life thinking that I was carrying this huge secret that I was born different, when, let's be real, it's not a secret. It's pretty obvious, Brooke, like, you look different. But I didn't share that part of my life, so therefore this podcast has let me just be more open, and that makes me feel so much more confident every single day. It's something that I honestly cannot put into words, but I swear, you guys, I walk around and I feel so different. I feel so liberated. I feel like, I don't have to hide a part of myself. It is honestly such an incredible feeling. Another thing is I've been telling people that I have a podcast. I've been telling coworkers like, oh yeah, I have a podcast all about my facial difference. And saying that out loud, I never would have said that before. I never would have said, oh, listen to my podcast where I talk about myself, where I let everyone know, my disability and about my hearing loss and about my syndrome. That's not something that I ever thought would happen. And I'm so glad that quote denial stage is over, where I can let it be known and verbally say I have a facial difference. Listen to my podcast where I talk all about it. It's such a freeing feeling, and I'm getting a little bit emotional because it's so incredible, and I wish that everyone could feel that. If you have something that you have just been dying to say, if you have something that's weighing heavily on you, just say it. Just let it out there, because I promise you, once it's out there, you might think it's, the end of the world, but once your secret is out there, it is so freeing. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Flourishing with a Facial Difference. Stay tuned for next week's episode, because I will be having my very first guest. I'm so excited to announce that next week I will be joined by a good friend of mine, Becca, and we will be talking all about mental health. You definitely don't want to miss it.